Hi, everybody. I'm here with writer John Buck. He goes by writer John Buck on Twitter, but he's just plain John Buck. And so he is attending university now, and he's doing a lot of work in biology, which I just found out a few minutes ago, which I find really interesting because I know so little about biology that he, in just getting one class in, will be way ahead of me. So that's where we stand. When you learn biology in the 1900s, you certainly don't pick up as much as what you're learning today. So that's another wonderful thing. So I want to, without further ado, I'm learning that John came from a family that was sort of anti-Catholic, and he's decided to be Catholic. He was raised as a Christian. So I want to just learn a little bit more from him about his story. And so I invited him on my channel to chat about that. So here we go. John, you want to share a little bit on where you came from and how you've kind of come to the Catholic side, even though your family was sort of anti-Catholic, you said?
Yeah, kind of. And like they're kind of mixed. Like my mother, she's much more so because she was raised Catholic in a Catholic school, had a bad experience, and so sort of turned against the faith from there. But she's still Christian. So yeah, I was raised in I guess, Hebrew roots movement form of Christianity, which is basically an attempt to sort of like try to fully integrate the Mosaic covenantal laws from the Old Testament in with the New Testament and the understanding of Jesus from that. But it's very much moving towards like trying to live and practice Jewish practices. So like I was raised keeping Sabbath and Passover, the other Jewish holidays, and but also still, I guess, somewhat identifying as a Christian, but like always keeping the Hebrew names for things. So like within the way I was raised, the Hebrew names for things have such a great emphasis. Where like like I don't believe in Jesus, I believe in Yahshua. So like that sort of thing, like trying to keep that sort of Jewish or Aramaic sort of pronunciation for the names. And so yeah, I was raised in that. And prior to that, my parents were very evangelical Christian, and then from that sort of evangelical movement went into the Messianic roots or Hebrew roots movement. And then yeah, so I guess probably around 2017 or so, I started to gain a broader like curiosity towards the outside world, and trying to understand things on a more intellectual level. Like at that point, I was learning a bit of philosophy, and so it was fun. And then yeah, I just got to a point where I was like curious as to why is it that I believe the things that I believe? Why is it that I hold to these beliefs? Like why is it that we hold to these practices and things like that? So that led me down a path of like trying to better understand what the early church was like right after Christ died, was resurrected. What were the early Christians doing? Because like we get a bit of that within Acts and some of the letters, but like history continues on past that. It's like the history doesn't end with John finally finishing the book of Revelation, and then lo and behold, we happen to find this book that has all these scriptures within it, and then like, oh, we don't need to look at history. So yeah, I was interested in like learning a little bit about the early history of the Christian church, and yeah, that led me into consideration of Eastern Orthodoxy for about like 2 years, where I was attending Eastern Orthodox Divine Liturgy, all while at the same time like learning a bit more about like Catholic theology, just because at that point I was really interested in Christian apologetics. And so I found that like, oh, wow, there's a whole history of Western philosophy within the Catholic sort of like Christian sphere. And so like reading Thomas Aquinas and some of the other doctors of the church from there. And then, yeah, like, yeah, at some point while considering Eastern Orthodoxy, I decided I felt like I needed to at least give Catholicism a fair shot as well. If I see that both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy both have a sort of prime right to continuity with the early church, I was like, well, I should better understand what is it that the Catholic Church teaches, and are they correct in what they teach? So through that, I went to RCIA and became Catholic 2021. Yeah.
Oh, you did. You
Yeah.
went through the whole process. Are you confirmed?
Yeah, I was confirmed in 2021. It's funny because I was like doing all the research sort of on my own beforehand. attending RCIA was almost like a formality to where, I don't know, I pretty much knew most of the stuff that they were going through, but it was still good to at least get a clear understanding of like, okay, yeah, here's what they're teaching for. And like, I didn't even complete the whole RCIA process. It was like I joined halfway through, was already sort of well ahead of everyone else in the group. So just was confirmed that Easter. Yeah.
Because I was confirmed so many years ago that I went through the whole process. Like I said, I was raised in Catholic school, and so I went through it way back then. But it's interesting because I went to the church. I've been going to the Catholic Church recently for about a month or so, and I finally got one of my sons, to go with me, and he's the one who wanted to go back to church, and so I finally got him to go with me just this past Sunday, and he thought, "This is great. Let's go every week. This is so great." He just loved it, and he's like, "I feel like the Catholic Church is really where it's at," because he likes how pretty, like, the church is beautiful itself.
Mhm.
And I think the Catholics, they have the history, like you mentioned. They have the churches themselves, those really beautiful European churches. And then they have the saints. And I think you just touched on that. I've just read Catherine of Siena's dialogues,
Mhm.
and I've been listening to Ignatius of Antioch, and I listened to some Clement of Rome. And also I've been listening to Irenaeus, and I'm just going on, Eusebius. And so I just think that it's so important, I think, to pretend, like, let's not pretend that the scriptures just fell out of the sky and we can only look at the scriptures. There's this long history. So I haven't read Thomas Aquinas because I don't know. I looked at the book. I got the book Summa Theologica, and it's 9,500 pages. So did you get through that, or how did you?
No, so I actually did buy the entire set of the Summa Theologica at some point, like for a birthday gift or something like that. The 5-volume set, each one is basically a Bible's worth of content. And
Wow.
there was a point where I was reading like a couple articles each night before bed, and I got almost all the way through the first volume. But yeah, besides that, I just mostly use it as reference material. Like, what did Thomas Aquinas teach about the speciation of angels or something like that? And so like, okay, here's his section on angels. I want to read about that. Why did Thomas Aquinas think that there were two wills within Christ? And so like, oh, well, here's his Christology section. Let's. And what I love about reading Thomas Aquinas is he'll start off each article with the arguments against the position. So, and he'll be drawing from sort of stuff within the tradition, like, oh, St. Augustine has said it here that so-and-so is the case. But that's exactly the opposite or like, here's the reasoning behind why we should deny this proposition because of something Augustine said. And then when he responds, no, here's why we should actually affirm this proposition, he'll respond to that sort of line of reasoning from St. Augustine and say, no, here's a way in which like we can understand Augustine without actually leading to that conclusion. So it's really great in that like he really steelmans his opponents, where like, and actually drawing from sort of like other figures within the sort of authority structure, where like, oh, we would hold Augustine's word as a strong sort of position of authority. So the fact that he's like has laid out this piece of reasoning here that would seem to make this proposition false, it's good to like just be able to respond to that exact argument. Anyway, that's just what I like about like reading Thomas Aquinas, is he's very thorough in his approach and also always careful to respond to the strongest versions of the counter arguments.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I've been binge listening to also Peter Kreeft, or Kreeft, for how you say that, but he also helped bring me back. So did Bishop Barron. So did all of these other people, Brant Petrie and Trent Horn. But the thing I wanted to mention is that when I was listening to Peter Kreeft, he was talking about Thomas Aquinas, and he was talking about the speciation of angels. And I thought he had this whole video on that. And I thought, like, he says each angel is its own species because, of course, they don't reproduce. And you don't even really think that. That's so weird. And so they must all, I mean, how would they?
Angels don't like reproduce or anything. So it's not like you and I, we share a common sort of nature or genus. Like we're both part of the same species of Homo sapiens because like we have ancestors that are all connected within that same species. But for angels, they don't reproduce at all. So like each one of them is going to be basically the entirety of their species, all located to themselves. And so, yeah, it's an interesting sort of picture. And like, I think, I don't know, I think it might even be related to like original sin and the fall and things like that, where like one member of the species of man fell. And so like the rest of the members within that same species have also fallen. Whereas for angels, it would be particular to that each angel. It's not the case that, oh, Gabriel fell. And so therefore, some other angel has also fallen. It's no, it would be particular to each one in regards to the original sin, I guess, or their location of the will either towards or against God.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of just going. One thing I noticed in the Bible, at first we have this impression, like if we talk about angels for a second, there's this impression that an angel is like either they're like a cherub. I have
Mhm.
pictures of cherubs in my room, and so they're that funny little cherub with little babies with wings on the back, or they're grown-ups. And in a lot of times we picture angels as females, at least I used to, females with these big wings.
Mhm.
And then you realize in the Bible, though, Gabriel and who is the other one? Raphael is one who's in some of the books, and then there's who's the other one? I'm forgetting.
Michael
Michael,
is
of
another.
course, the
Yeah,
archangel. So
yeah.
you've got these three angels, and then all the times the angels appear in the Old Testament, they're always male. There's no
Mm.
female. I don't think there's a mention of a female angel. So maybe it's just maybe all the angels are male. What do you think? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, they probably wouldn't like be classified under male or female because there would be no like sexual reproduction between the angels. I tend to think that like angels would just sort of like reveal themselves to humans in a way that makes it the human more comfortable to experiencing them. And so like given that they're coming from a position of a sort of like authority, they're coming from God, then there might be a sort of like attempt to sort of like have that sort of stature of authority there alongside it. And so like we tend to like sort of hold police officers or somebody like large people in a sort of stature of like awe in a sense. So like that probably makes sense as to why they might generally take on a male masculine nature or
Mhm.
appearance.
Yeah, it makes sense, and it's really interesting stuff. And so I think it's funny. Sid Tom says we got Cupid, the underrated angel. So hi to everybody in the chat. Good to see you, Steve Raval, London Theist, Nikki, and Sid Tom. But London Theist, our good friend here, Dean, he's got a question for you. He says, "What's your view on the fall and original sin? Literal Adam and Eve or allegorical?" That's such a hard question, actually.
Yeah, it is. Because like there was a period where I was much more like in line with the allegorical reading. So like my journey back into Christianity or like taking Christianity seriously was through Jordan Peterson, who takes an entirely allegorical reading to sort of like the Old Testament, or at least like that's at least how he is reading or interpreting the biblical text is through a sort of psychological lens. And so there was a while where, like, yeah, it made sense to me that the fall of Adam and Eve is almost like a story representative of every single individual person sort of um, falling like through temptation and going against the will of God. But I don't know. I've lately been doing some reading and listening to other people. So I don't know if you know Josh Swamidas.
Oh
I went
yeah.
I went to the Capturing Christianity conference #2, and he was presenting a sort of lecture on how you can have a fully coherent understanding of like evolution while still saying that there were these two individual human beings that have a um, ancestral connection to all of us. And basically, the way it would be, you would have like the Homo sapiens that are all interbreeding before then, and then God specially creates these two individuals, and then those two individuals will intermix with the rest to the point that, like, over time, everyone at some period of time will have some sort of relation back to Adam and Eve, even if they weren't the first Homo sapiens, they would still be like, I guess, the first people chosen by God to sort of tend his garden. So that's where I kind of think about it like right now is that God took two, or either specially created two human beings or like took two human beings and put them into a place in which giving them a role of trying of tending the garden. So like a special role that they were lifted up towards. And so when they rejected God and disobeyed him, then the role that they had would have been diminished, and their natural inheritance in God through eternal life would be have been lost. So that's like a partial mix between Josh Swamitdas's view and also John Walton's, who I also quite favor his sort of like reading of Genesis.
Yeah, very well thought out. And so, yet Craig is saying destroy him, and Sid Tom says he met you at the conference. Do you remember Sid Tom?
Yeah. We met quite a bit. Talked a little bit about Catholicism. It's funny. There was quite a few people there at the Capturing Christianity conference who were more than favorable towards Catholicism. So we might be seeing a bit of a turn within the young apologetics sphere towards Rome.
Yeah, I tell you what, there's a bunch of reasons. I made a video on this, so you can watch my video if you want to see all my reasons. But the reason, one of the reasons I came back is I remember Robert Reed is one of the first people who said this. He said Christians can't even make up your own mind on you got 40,000 different denominations. So until you get your act together, come to me then. And I thought, wait a second, maybe we need an authority. Maybe that's important. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, but I need to know the truth about Mother Mary. That was the clincher for me, because there's Catholics definitely think one thing. And so I thought, I'm going to listen to what the early saints said about Mother Mary, and I think I'll give them some credence. And so I looked at Ignatius of Antioch, who was John. He was working under John, the apostle, and John, of course, was watching Mary, taking care of Mary. And so I'm certain that John would have a pretty good handle on that. And he basically said she's a perpetual virgin. And so when you get that, and then you have Irenaeus and all of these other people, Justin Martyr, and then finally you get to St. Jerome saying it, I think to myself, why am I listening to what the heresies, the heretics were saying, like Helvidius and Jerome wrote against him? Why am I listening to them instead of the actual saints? It's just, and I thought to myself, I'm going to listen to the saints. I mean, this is a choice I made, but it seemed to be a rational choice in my mind. And I don't know, have you given any thought to that and Mother Mary? And
yeah, I mean, certainly coming from a Protestant background, it was always very awkward to sort of like begin to pray towards Mary or the other saints. And in fact, yeah, I'm sure like my parents are very uncomfortable by the fact that I pray the rosary. But there was something I had like, there you go. Yeah, I don't have mine on me, but something I had found interesting that apparently like in the book of John, like there's the one apostle that's always referred to as the beloved of Christ, or something like that, which we take to be, okay, this is John just referring to himself. But you kind of think about it, that would be a really sort of like narcissistic name nomenclature to sort of give to yourself. Oh yeah, I'm just going to write this story about me, and I'm going to give myself the nomenclature beloved of Christ. But like apparently there's a sort of like Hebraic literary approach where you have this sort of like vague character who doesn't have a name exactly, but like they have just a sort of nomenclature, I guess, but no specific name. And that's supposed to sort of represent you as the audience. Like you're reading this and like, oh, I'm just supposed to, like this vague nondescript person is supposed to represent me. And so it is interesting then that like at the end there, when Christ is on the cross and he says to the beloved one, the beloved disciple, that like, behold your mother, and he says to Mary, behold your son. And so like, if John is writing in a way so as to have the character of the beloved disciple not just to be representative of himself, but to be representative of the entire church, then when Christ is telling the beloved disciple, behold your mother, he's telling the entire church, behold your mother. And so, yeah, I haven't like put too much research into that, but it was something that I had heard a while back. It's like, oh, that's a really interesting approach and something to think about. But yeah, I'm sure you've done a lot more research than I have in this sort of area.
Well, that actually, I have to say, I went to this Greek Orthodox, I would say it made like a church museum sort of thing over in St. Augustine. And this was a year ago or so. And I remember this, it was so cool in there. I loved it. And it just seemed really historic. And I can see why people would go into that. But I have this little booklet that they gave me called Behold Your Mother. And so I had the book sitting on my desk for for all that time. I didn't even bother reading it. And then this summer, as I'm starting to kind of drift back, I'm starting to look at that book. And I thought, that is a really good argument. Why did Jesus, if Jesus had these siblings, then why
Right.
would he give his mother over to somebody who was not related to him by blood? And so I thought to myself, that seems strange, especially because apparently there's Jewish tradition and law that you would legally, the brothers would be bound to take care of her if there are brothers. And so then I started looking and I realized, like, if you read the book of Mark, it talks about the brothers. So you've got Simon, Joseph, or Joseph, and Jude. So you've got these three, and they're also named as the sons of the other Mary. And the other Mary was married to Clopas, or also he's called Alphaeus. And so then you see them as cousins because Alphaeus or Clopas was Joseph's brother. And so you can see how this whole thing works out. So whenever they related it to them as the brothers, it sort of fits together as it was just an extended family. The Hebrews didn't have a word for brothers or for cousins. They just referred, even in the Old Testament, they called them brethren or brothers if they're talking about cousins.
Right.
So I thought,
like,
okay, I
what is
could.
it? Abraham and Lot, like they refer to them as brothers, even though like we know the exact family structure that, yeah, Abraham was Lot's cousin. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that, I mean, that whole, I think that's fascinating. And have you looked into any of the Marian apparitions? And do you think that we need to, like, I've heard from the Pope that you don't need to necessarily buy into those. If you've looked into them, you don't have to say, okay, I'm going to definitely go with that. But I know the church has supported a lot of those, like the Fatima appearances and that kind of thing. Have you looked in any of that?
Somewhat, but yeah, like what you're saying, the church teaches that the Marian apparitions aren't like required dogmas of the faith or anything like that. They can be recognized as sort of private revelations. So take it with it as you will. But yeah, there's been some like pretty remarkable things that have been going on, especially with the appearances at Fatima, because like you had a whole audience of plenty of skeptical members within like atheists and non-Catholics all over, and like each of them were all looking at I want to say like 1,500 people, but somewhere around there, I think that, and then they all saw like the sun dancing or something like that. It was like just a really weird thing for like a group hallucination to all take place when like group hallucinations is not like a typical thing that is really noted at all. But so yeah, the Lady of Fatima was a remarkable one. Yeah, and like there's quite a few others that have taken place. But yeah, it's definitely something that I want to do more research on, as well as like some of the different Eucharistic miracles as well. Like there's been sort of records or recorded instances and like still like pictures taken of like the Eucharistic host bleeding, and yeah, it's a lot of really remarkable stuff that is all taking place within the Catholic history. Now, of course, like if you're not Catholic, you're just going to say, "Oh, they faked that" or something like that. But there's a lot to it, and so there's a lot to definitely like if it was being faked, like you would have to have a whole lot of conspirators, and even then, like the things that were being faked would be like, how would they even be able to fake that? Like it's not the case that you can like weave in heart tissue into a piece of like a sacramental host or anything like that. Like it's just really remarkable, and it's not the case that you can like group hallucinate the sun moving to and fro within the skies. Yeah, some wild stuff. Yeah.
Oh, it's totally wild stuff. And the thing is that I've been noticing lately is that because of the Fatima, so at Fatima, Mary had she appeared to these three kids first, and she appeared to them over a period on the 13th of each month, starting in May, all the way up until October 13th, 1917. And the interesting thing was she told them, and she also said this to somebody else in the 19th century, she had warned them about Russia. And also about the Masons, like in another prior one, she warned people about the Mason sect. And that's a sect that it's still in existence today. It's very secretive and that kind of thing. And some presidents have been involved in that sect. But she warned about the dangers of them and the dangers of Russia. And she said that Russia needed to be consecrated to her. So some popes have tried to consecrate Russia to her because she said it's going to do a lot of evil things. And she especially focused on Ukraine as far as some of the evil activities that were going to happen. And she mentioned that. And so she warned them. And so now we've got Pope, apparently I just heard Pope Francis back in March, he went up in front of a bunch of bishops and he tried again to consecrate Russia. And he told the bishops to go consecrate it. And so people are praying for this. So we'll see, because obviously the war's going on right now. And we got it's an atrocious thing. And so have you thought about any of that kind of stuff or heard about any of that?
Yeah, I heard about when it happened. Yeah, back in March, I guess. And apparently, there's been a sort of like consecration of Russia to Mary prior to that, when one of the popes basically consecrated the whole world, and so the whole world would include Russia. And I think that even it was sort of recognized by one of the children at Fatima that yeah, this qualifies as the consecration of Russia to Mary. But I don't know. I think even if it was Russia was already previously consecrated, just being able to specifically call it out now at this point in time is very worthwhile. And yeah,
Mhm.
we all need her prayers for us, especially yeah those in Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah, especially I can't even imagine living over there because I find it fascinating, and I put this on Twitter a lot because my kids took a Holocaust history class as an elective, and that was just sort of given to them. The school sometimes picks the electives, and they were fine with that. It's actually one of their favorite classes. But
Mhm.
I think it's great that people know a lot about the Holocaust. At least most people know and acknowledge that. The vast majority, I should say, 99.99. But the issue, the Holodomor that happened in 1933, where Russia intentionally starved Ukraine, and about 9 million Ukrainians perished that year because they couldn't get food. They cut off all their food. And I look at something like that and I ask people, I didn't even know about that. I never heard about that. And you don't hear that much about communism in the schools. They're not talking about how awful it is. And so I feel like our schools are doing us a disservice in that.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. But yeah,
Yeah. So a mass hallucination, Dave M is saying it's a common explanation for mass UFO sightings. The idea of a hallucination, if you look up what that is in psychology, it's something that happens inside your brain. So just like you can't share a dream with somebody, you can't share a hallucination. So it would be a mass visual that people received, not a
yeah,
hallucination.
yeah. It seems like the simpler explanation is no, there's something that caused this sort of like mass experience to occur, rather
Yeah.
than like each individual person something within their particular neurochemistry that caused that experience to occur. Um,
Yeah, yeah, so that's the thing. So I'm just curious, which saints, now you mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas, which ones do you think, if you have you listened to besides Thomas Aquinas, or would you recommend, or you think you might want to listen to more of?
oh yeah. So like when I was still considering Eastern Orthodoxy, I was reading a couple of the early church fathers. Um, so I read Saint Athanasius on the Incarnation is an
Mm.
excellent book for anyone that is curious about the atonement and the Incarnation, how to understand it. It's such a great book, and it's a real short one too. Very useful. Like there's a line from there, like God became man so that man could partake in God. It's like such a great line. Yeah, and Saint John of Damascus, I want to say he had the book on the divine images, which is like a defense of the use of iconography within the church, since like that's definitely a point of contention within a lot of Christians, for sure, both currently and also within history as well. So that's a good book as well. Saint Augustine, he's also a great writer. So read his On the Trinity, which was like really remarkable, and being able to understand like his view of the Trinity and how it sort of makes sense and is coherent. Um, as well as yeah, like Confessions is such a remarkable story that Augustine went through, and so
Hmm.
yeah, there's quite a few great saints
Yeah,
to
yeah.
pick and
I
choose.
started listening to Augustine's City of God too, and I thought that was beautifully written.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, he's
yeah, a
got
remarkable literary figure. Like whether or not you're Christian, like his works have been hugely monumental in the Western canon.
one of the things that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and this relates to Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, is these people are church doctors. So there's 37 church doctors, and it was interesting because my confirmation saint was St. Catherine of Siena, and
Hmm.
so I thought to myself, I should really go read what she wrote. And she's got this really interesting book that's a dialogue. Well, let me preface this: St. Catherine of Siena was illiterate. And she was just totally, from the day one, like when she was born, she was totally devoted to God, and she was totally devoted to Jesus and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that happened was she started having, like, she would have these these experiences with God speaking to her. And so she asked somebody to write down what God was saying. And so she would repeat what God said to her, and the friend would record it in the dialogue. And God mentioned in there Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Jerome. He mentioned them as his beloved, the church saints and doctors and that kind of thing. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go read what they had to say, because that was really cool to listen to that. And I'm just, St. Catherine of Siena is if you read the dialogue, it's at such a high level of communication skills that it would no way that a woman who's illiterate could possibly put words together like that on her own. That it was just incredible.
Wow. Yeah.
So I'd recommend that book.
Yeah. I definitely want to read it now. Yeah.
So have you been in any of the big, huge churches that they have in Europe or any, because I saw that you were over there with London Theist you were over in England, which is where they have really cool churches.
Yeah. That was like one of the highlights for sure, was going over in London, and then went over to went over in other parts of the UK. Went and saw Nathan Ormond there as well. Met up with him. But yeah,
you did.
Yeah. It was fun hanging out with him. But yeah, the churches there are just huge, and like a lot of Anglican churches, unfortunately. But I mean, it's still a lot of them were, I guess, technically Catholic churches that were just renovated over into the Anglican community. But yeah, it was remarkable. And then just recently, I was over in St. Louis and went to the Basilica there. That's a great church as well. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's because it's funny, because my brother married a girl who's from England, and they're both kind of agnostic and that sort of thing. But she's apparently, when she was in England, she was a bell ringer at one of those big churches. And so they were talking about, they got married during COVID, but they were talking about if they were going to get married in the church, it would be this beautiful ceremonial wedding. And I thought, all the bells ringing and all that formality, I thought that'd be really cool.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was blown away when I went into Italy, and I went into the Piazza del Duomo years ago in Milan, and that it is awe-striking. I mean, the word awesome, we cheapen it in this language, because that was awesome. I mean, you can't, it was without words. You walk in there and you're so stunned at how this architecture is so incredibly immense and beautiful and detailed. And you think to yourself, this is worthy of God. This is God's house. I mean, actually, probably it's not even worthy of God, but it's getting closer to what humans could possibly put together.
Yeah. That's the great thing about, like, I find within the Catholic faith, is this sort of tripartite sort of structure of like trying to conform our lives to of the goodness, the beauty, and the truth. So like those sort of three aspects of God, or the where like you have the goodness of the saints. You're able to be inspired by the lives of these saints that have given up their own lives for others, like Maximilian Kolbe during the Holocaust, and plenty of other examples as well, like Mother Teresa and things like that. So you have this witness of goodness within the Catholic history. Then you have the witness of beauty from within the mass itself being performed, and also the beautiful architecture that has been sort of laid out through Western history, and like the beauty of literary as well, like with figures such as Catherine of Siena or St. Augustine. And then, the goodness of truth as well, that like this very strong, this very strong academic sort of understanding of the faith, so that it can be comprehended, it can be understood, it can be explained, it can be taught. We can understand the faith within the context of everything else that we know. It's not the case that we have to sort of sanction our beliefs. Oh, this is the things I believe religiously, and these are the things I believe secularly. No, like everything is part of this one total whole of knowledge and what we can know and believe within the same sort of structure. And that's what like I really appreciate about the Catholic faith. And as well as like being able to understand that like the church isn't teaching everything. It's not the case. Like there's room for disagreement even within the Catholic Church, where like, for instance, regarding evolution or special creation with like Adam and Eve, like that's an area that's open to debate within the church. It's not the case that the church says you must believe in evolution, or you must believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. Like, this is an area of disagreement that is permitted within the church. And then there's other areas that are not permitted for disagreement. Like, no, this is a dogma of the church. You cannot dissent against it without ceasing to be Catholic. And so it is really nice to have these sort of guardrails open and in sight, where like, okay, I can see that this is within the Catholic teaching and this is outside Catholic teaching. But like within Catholic teaching, there's areas that you can go in one direction or the other. Whereas I found that in other like faith systems, there's almost like a tendency towards being very authoritarian in regards to, no, you must perfectly conform your entire set of beliefs with everyone else so that we all hold this exact same structure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that I think that one of the things, and I think this is kind of just to bring it back, one of the things that I was thinking about was with the Protestants and 66 books of the Bible, and the Catholics have 73 books. So they have these additional books. I've got them here. They call it, the Protestants call these Apocrypha, and the Catholics call it Deuterocanonical books. And I went through them, and you can see all these little stickies. I'm going to go through and do a video on this at some point. But I went through and I tried to find some beliefs that what happened is Martin Luther didn't really like these books. And one of the reasons he didn't like it is because there's intercessory prayers through the saints, and there's things like that justified in there, and intercessory prayer through an angel, Raphael. And there is a lot of other things, like a purgatory is referenced, something very similar to purgatory, where there's a cleansing process, which I think is also consistent with what's in the Bible, like in 1 Corinthians 3:15. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because I thought to myself, I was kind of overwhelmed by the amount of additional material that Catholics have, because not only do they have those 7 additional books in the Bible, they've also got this massive history and all these saints and all these catechisms and all this stuff. And I thought, can I even handle all this? It was so much easier with the Protestants. I only had my little 66 books, and that was it. Sola Scriptura. So then I thought, it seemed kind of overwhelming and like this gigantic elephant. And I started kind of digging at that gigantic elephant, and I started enjoying it. And I thought, this is fun learning all this stuff from the 1st century and the 2nd century. And I'm starting going by centuries as I'm going through these saints.
Oh, wow. Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, in a sense, it almost like makes sense. Like, if the church has been around for 2,000 years now, then like, shouldn't there be like a plethora of stuff that has accumulated over time? But like, if we were to think that, like, no, basically the apostles, they wrote the scriptures of the New Testament, and then basically that's all you really need from here on out. This is like, wow, there's been a whole, like, history doesn't matter at all. Basically, you just have the Bible and that's it. And then, yeah, it just seems like having this sort of like broader scope that you can sort of step into is much more I don't know, fitting in a sense, rather than something that like, nope, I understand all of it and I'm done with it, but rather being able to sort of like step into the ocean and be sort of overwhelmed, but be able to be part of it, versus, oh, I have my own very own pond and this is my own that I can sort of fully have on my property. So I don't know, I've been somewhat relieved in that, like, I don't need to know everything about the Catholic faith. There's almost like specializations that takes place within the church where people can focus on particular topics that they're most interested in, either because like there's something in tension with them and they want to get a better understanding of it, but or just because they have a favorability towards it. And then other people can also have these other areas, and like working together, we can like better defend the entire community well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just see Nadimo says he's going to make my life more interesting.
Uh-oh.
Bread of Life must have been running a video at the same time, I guess. That's classic. So yeah, no, I think you're right. You can I was curious to see what the Catholic take was on certain topics, and all of a sudden in church they mentioned something about the death sentence. And I didn't realize Catholics have a position against the death sentence. And so I thought, okay, good. I'll be against the death sentence now, and I can be morally consistent when I say you can't abort babies too.
Yeah. Now, that is, at least right now, it's not like defined as a dogma of the church. It is just something that has currently, like, Pope Francis has put forward, like, as Catholics, we should be against capital punishment because it goes against the dignity of the human person. Now, technically, you can remain Catholic and dissent against that opinion from the Pope. But at least I see it as like, okay, here is the Pope. He's sort of like here as a teacher to sort of help build us in our moral growth. So we should try to apply his teaching to actual practical matters, and so also therefore be against capital punishment and death sentence insofar as we are able to. So.
Yeah, and I also found out because my husband and I just did our will, like we officially got a will. We should have done this a long time ago, I know, but we finally went and got it. And the plan was he was going to be buried at sea. He wants to be buried at sea, and I don't know how I'm going to work that out. And I have to be. I said I would be cremated and distributed at sea. And then I found out that the Catholics, no, you can't get distributed. Like you can get cremated, but they don't want you distributing your ashes all over the sea. Like you have to keep them all together. So I would have to keep them in a container, and then the container would go into the sea.
There you go. Yeah, that could work.
That's the plan. So it's just interesting looking at they've thought through a lot of this stuff. I think that's one of the benefits of that is you can go and say, okay, what's their take on this? And, okay, 1544, they decided this. And so there's just a lot of different things. So yeah, I see this. Does anyone know on the chat here? It says Rebecca's reevaluating her message. Bread of life is gone. What's going on with that? I hope I had Rebecca on my channel not too long ago, so hopefully everything's okay.
Oh. Well, I don't know. She had mentioned to me at some point that she was like maybe considering moving on from her particular ministry approach. So I don't know if that's part of it.
Yeah, well, hopefully she keeps the channel up. Just maybe takes a break and comes back to it. Sometimes
people just want to sort of like change her sort of strategy, maybe.
Yeah. So I've kind of changed my strategy on my channel because I used to, when I first get in here, I did all these coffee talks and I would have big groups of people and sometimes there'd be some infighting and I was like, and then I had open channels, sometimes open mics, and I would get people in here sometimes asking really uncomfortable questions that were totally ridiculous. And I had to turn the channel and I decided, wait a second, I'm not doing an open mic with strangers. I was like, and Rebecca had a crazy one. She had an open mic and a stranger got in there and I forget what it was, but it was something really bad. And it was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I just find like when listening to it, when there's like 9 people all in a group, it's hard for there to be like a coherent sort of pathway or dialogue to take place. It's just everyone's trying to fill in, just say something. I much more prefer 2 to 4 people as a sort of like amount of people to discuss a topic.
Yeah, I think that seems fair. And so what's your schedule? Do you have a preferred time to go to the Catholic Mass, or do you prefer a certain day? Because I know we're supposed to go once a week. That's sort of the deal, at least once a week.
Well, you have to go on Sundays for sure, or Saturday evenings, because that's technically part of Sunday. And then, like when able to, I'll try to attend like a weekday Mass if I can. Like if I've got I'm just pretty busy right now, but like when I can, usually I'll try to get a morning Mass before work. But usually on Sundays around noon or so, somewhere around then.
Yeah, that's when we went at 11:30 this last week. I like it's interesting too, because one of the things that actually made me cry a couple weeks ago was because I went into the Catholic Church at the 5:30 on Sunday service. And I actually loved that service because it was contemporary music. And so I was hearing the same songs I heard in the Baptist church. And I loved it so much that I started I was just bawling sitting there. And I'm like trying to cover up. And I'm like, because it was the best stuff. They were singing like Bless the Lord, Oh My Soul with Matt Redman and all these great songs.
Yeah, it's kind of nice that the fact that like the church has many different times to perform Mass, that you can have a different type of Mass at different points of time in the day. So like later in the day, you'll have more contemporary. Early on, you'll have sort of like more low Masses. So it's really nice that like, okay, if you prefer a particular type of a Mass, you can just attend at that time. If you're not picky, then come whenever. When I was going to Eastern Orthodox Church, it was always at one time. And that's mostly just because like there's not as many Eastern Orthodox people as Catholics within the United States. So, but it is a sort of nice privilege that we get to appreciate.
So actually, I should ask you about that because I've never been to an Eastern Orthodox church. What is it like? Is it really similar? Because I understand it's pretty similar to Catholics.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. It's more, I would say, somewhat intimate, at least at the Eastern Orthodox churches that I've gone to. And it's more censorious, I guess, because like there's a lot more you're much more participating within the mass, where you're standing and singing responses, and the priest will come out with incense and go all throughout the aisles to spread the incense. And so it's very like sensory experience where you're very much it's sort of activating all of your senses. And like the church is generally covered with icons, so like you'll look up, and within the dome there's like a huge mosaic of Christ, and then like all throughout the walls of the church you'll have different visual representations of the stories of the Bible, like the flood, the resurrection, the crucifixion, and all the others. And so like it's very visually stimulating. And then yeah, there's a lot of iconography. I'm pronouncing it still wrong.
That's a tough
Where
one.
like as you go up to receive communion, you'll generally bow down and kiss the icon of the Virgin Mary and Christ. So yeah, it's very much active in sort of bringing you in. Also, the Eucharist is different there. So rather than only receiving the bread, the unleavened bread, as in Catholic Mass, they will have essentially this the bread and the wine mixed together all in one large chalice, and then they'll spoon feed each of the individuals that come up for communion. So they're receiving both the bread and the wine together in one, rather than just separated, just getting the bread, whereas the priest would in Catholic masses will also drink the wine as well. So yeah, it's like I would definitely recommend attending a divine liturgy from an Eastern Orthodox church at some point, just because it is a remarkable service. And there are like Byzantine Rite Catholic churches as well, which is like the Eastern churches sort of grafted into the Western, or grafted into the Catholic Church, where there was these churches and their sort of divine liturgy still practiced today, but they are in submission to the Roman Pontiff, the Pope. So definitely listen to attend those as well if you want to go to those.
Yeah, I don't even know in my area. I mean, I'm sure there's a church in Tampa, and I know for sure there's a church in Tarpon Springs, because Tarpon Springs is very Greek, and I have I have Greek friends who live out there, and so they go to this Greek Orthodox church. So I know there's some there. But I'm just thinking, one of the things I was just thinking about is the rosary. So I wanted to bring this up because when I was back, I spent 10 years as a Baptist, as I think you know, and I was raised Catholic, as I said, but I didn't really remember how to pray the rosary. I mean, I remembered it was all the Hail Marys, and then it was Our Father, like Hail Mary, Hail. But I wanted to mention this just for people watching, just so they know what this really is, because you have a certain prayers. You're initially starting out the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Then you do an Our Father, 3 Hail Marys, and an Our Father. Oh no, I'm sorry. Then you do the Apostles' Creed. Yeah. Then you do this process, and then you say glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. And then you consider something about, like, in each of these decades, they call them, there's 10 Hail Marys, then there's an Our Father, and there's 5 decades. And so I wanted to mention that because in each one, there's some, you're recalling while you're praying them an event in Jesus's life, or the sorrows of Mary, and so, or the joys of Mary, like the Annunciation, the Visitation, and that kind of thing. And so you're going through and you're recalling these events with respect to Jesus and with respect to Mary. And so it's like a reflection on the whole gospel message, which that part I don't recall from my childhood. And I don't know, do you, like you said, you pray the rosary, do you do it that way? Where you think about these events? And
yeah, I try to, like, especially being a new Catholic, it is still somewhat difficult to be more confident in praying the rosary without, like, because like I still have the booklet that I got from church, to that way I can follow along with it for sure. But especially for the first few Hail Marys, I have that sort of like whatever the mystery is sort of in mind. There was a Catholic, I want to say Jimmy Akin, actually, from Catholic Answers. He recommended that, like, a way to sort of like represent the mystery while praying is to just imagine yourself in that time and place, praying the rosary in that time and place. So like the crowning of the thorns on Jesus. Like if you could just imagine yourself, I'm there watching it, and while I'm there, I'm praying the rosary. And like that's a way to sort of like try to visualize it and better like reflect and contemplate the mysteries of the rosary while also doing the rosary. But I find like when I'm doing that, if I'm focusing too hard on that, I lose track of like, wait, did I move up a beat or do I have to go back or something like that? So I always try to like just pray whichever extras. Like even if I'm not sure, I was like, I'll just pray one extra Hail Mary just in case. But,
I do that too. Or sometimes I'll start thinking of something else and I'll be like, I have my finger on a bead and I have my finger on the next bead and I'm like, uh-oh, did I just miss something? I better start.
Yeah.
So, and I just figured I think I'm going to do, I haven't been back. What I decided I'm doing this Saturday, and I finally decided, because I looked into how I would do this. I'm going to do the sacrament of reconciliation. So I've got to say, forgive me, Father. And I mentioned this on my live stream, but I just haven't done it yet. 42 years I haven't been there.
Yeah.
And say, forgive me, Father. It's been 42 years. You can imagine all the sins that have piled up over 42 years. I don't know. He's probably going to freak out and drop over his chair because I've got a lot of stuff to talk about, but I'll have to condense it because I'm just going to say, okay, the 20s was bad.
There you go. Well, yeah. I definitely want to offer my encouragement to you for this Saturday because, yeah, that's a big deal. And like, I know for myself, my first confession, it was very, very hard to go through, but yeah, it's such a relief after having done so that like it's well worth the sort of anxiety building up to it and actually going about finally being able to step out of the confession booth. Like, whew, it's very, very much a relief. I wanted to mention one thing, like in regards to the rosary, just a sort of interesting prayer habit of the Eastern Orthodox churches. They'll have prayer ropes, which are basically like the rosary, and they'll instead of doing a Hail Mary for each bead, for each knot of the prayer rope, they'll do Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner, and then they'll just go through that and circulate through the prayer rope and or they might shorten it to be like, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Christ have mercy. And it is really interesting, both within the Eastern Rite and also the Catholic sort of practice, that it is a very meditative sort of prayer approach, where it is sort of like helping you to sort of like lose all the extraneous sort of like bits of thinking and things like that, but actually be able to focus in on praying the prayers and being able to get out of your head and I don't know, just be more focused on the things that are worthy of our contemplation.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, because I was wondering if the Eastern Orthodox had anything kind of similar to that, because they broke off in 1054, somewhere around there, 1030, somewhere in the. And so when they broke off, I thought, okay, a lot of the stuff with the rosary that came about with St. Dominic apparently after that. And so he was the first one to bring. But before that, I just read a book about the rosary. People were using these prayer beads. And so he just sort of put it all together. And Mother Mary directed him to put it together. And apparently she's appeared to other people and directed them to use the rosary. And so I think you're right. It's meditation. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is the sacraments, because one of the things also that Protestants did was Martin Luther said, okay, we can have the Eucharist, the communion, we'll have that. I like the fact that the Eucharist or the communion is delivered at least at Lutheran churches at every service. So for sure you're getting communion whenever you go. At Baptist services, they were only giving it every 3 months. And I missed that. Like I felt like I need to have the Eucharist more. And so that was something that I kind of was really missing. But then they have reconciliation, and people would argue, well, no, you don't need to, you can just pray and ask for forgiveness from God. And you certainly should do that. But it's part of the idea from James, and also even from some other passages, that it just is a good idea also to share with people around you. And they gave us that intermediary of the Father. So you can go, you can't, like, I wouldn't be able to go downstairs and tell my kids or my husband every single thing I've done in my whole life. I'm just not going to be able to do that. But I can certainly go to this stranger.
Right.
Who's not that strange. I hope we have that one room, like he can't see me. Like I hope, I don't know how it's going to be set up, because that's how it was in the church where I grew up. Like they were behind this wall.
Yeah, it's funny. At least for the churches, they'll have basically two options where you can either sit and confess face to face or go behind the wall. So it's like up to you, basically. It seems like every church I've been to, there's always that wall option that you can use, which has been handy for sure.
I remember, actually, this is kind of crazy. So the last time I was in this, I remember I was in the 8th grade, and I remember it was one of my friends. Unfortunately, unfortunately, she had sex with somebody in the 8th grade. And so she goes in, we all go in and we spend like 5 minutes in there basically. And you say, okay, go say 10 Hail Marys and 3 Our Fathers or something like that and repent. And my friend was in there for, it seemed like a half hour. And my other friend tells me, oh my gosh, she must have let him know. And I'm like, what did she let him know? What did she do? It's like, 8th grade. What are you doing? You know, it's crazy. So yeah, so she finally comes out. It's like,
Well, that's good. Yeah.
that was nuts. So she was a pretty wild girl, wild Catholic girl.
Yeah, you're
So yeah, that was nuts. But so the other thing I just wanted to mention with some of these other sacraments is you notice some of the stuff that's going on today with, I feel like it's satanic influences in some way. That's like it's breaking up every single sacrament. So I think the baptism relates closely to just the value, the intrinsic value of human life, and this idea of uniting us in a way with God. And I feel that abortions that's the opposite. Like here you're killing the baby and devaluing a baby inside of you. And in those cases where it's just because the baby's inconvenient, I find that deeply sad. And then the Eucharist is this idea that we want to go and just have this, take in Christ as often as possible. And reconciliation is this idea that we're coming together and we're letting God know that we're telling others our sins and we're asking for forgiveness and that kind of a thing. And I feel that some of the stuff that we see today, like with the way that people are just, you saw the I don't know if you saw the thing with Matt Walsh where they're talking about what they're doing over in Tennessee at Vanderbilt, where they're operating on these kids. And again, getting away from God's value and this idea that we're made in God's image. I just see a lot of stuff that's going on. It's like going against the sacraments in some way, and holy matrimony. I mean, if we could talk about that, and then this idea of is marriage between a male and a female, and how do we deal with that? And so it's like it's kind of like going through all the sacraments, these sort of things. I don't know if you've given that any thought.
Yeah, I've heard similar sort of comments being made, but there's this sort of like reversal or inversion of the sacraments in order to really degrade them or to degrade the human person. So like, yeah, you can see definitely like the sacrament of marriage between a man and a woman, how there's this sort of like inversion where like, oh, sex is just meaningless, where like it's casual, where it's no longer this sort of bond for the purpose of procreation. It's this sort of like means of just using the other person as an object for your lust to pleasure you. But there's like for each sacrament, there is a sort of like maybe an inverted version of that, I guess. Like, I don't know, maybe even for the sacrament of holy unction or like the oil for the sick, you could almost say that like maybe euthanasia is a sort of like, rather than like trying to heal the person's spirit at this time of need, let's just end them and put them out of their misery, let's say. But it is. These are the things that the church has sort of put up. Like, these are what we need to value and put most emphasis on and be able to hold upright as important, whereas the rest of society is sort of like disregarding those for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're hitting on a good point, because it also reminds me, I did a survey of, I took a survey, I should say, I think I've talked about this before, but on the World Value Survey, I isolated the United States and I isolated generations. And I found that the younger generations, who are not the X, so X and the boomers were older generations, there's a statistically significantly different value system for them. They're more likely to justify abortion, suicide, prostitution, homosexuality, all this kind of stuff. And this is very significant. So people who are basically 40 and under, it's that crew of people. And that includes people like my kids. And so I thought to myself, now, why is this? And I thought, well, society right now has been pushing this value of tolerance and acceptance. And I think that kind of plays into that sort of thing. And I'm worried about that, because I feel, I mean, the interesting thing is the generations did not have a difference in euthanasia. So both older and younger are more accepting of euthanasia, which can get pretty dangerous. I mean, when you just make it so easy that, oh, life's really inconvenient, I'm not happy anymore, you get those kind of cases too lopped in.
Yeah, definitely. And like, how are you supposed to determine whether this is somebody that is just depressed and prone towards suicide, or is this somebody that is like a valid subject of euthanasia, like if there even is such a class. But like, yeah, like just because somebody wants to kill themselves, why does that mean that like we should therefore like indulge that desire of theirs? And now I get like it does pull on your heartstrings when you see somebody in pain and suffering, but like there's still ways in which we can respond to the pain that they're having without just ending them. It's just uh, yeah, it's funny. Even before becoming Catholic, like one of my first stepping into a Catholic church was like to attend some lecture that was on like the ethics of euthanasia from a Catholic perspective. It was really interesting to get a better understanding of the Catholic viewpoint on this. So, but yeah, it is interesting. Like in entering into the church, there's sort of this whole field of practical ethics that you now have to take into consideration. Like growing up, like I knew abortion was wrong and all of that, but like it's only since becoming Catholic that I'm actually trying to be more involved within the pro-life field and like trying to actually actively work out these values in the political domain. Whereas previously I was much more, I guess, libertarianly prone. But yeah, it is. I just really appreciate that aspect of the church is not just somebody who teaches its values and just expects its congregants to do as they wish. Like, oh yeah, these are just your religious beliefs, but you can vote how you please. But is actually focusing on, no, if you're actually a Catholic and you want to live out the Catholic life, then that's going to include voting for and against these certain policies. And yeah, I appreciate that connectedness between the political field, the political realm, and the religious realm.
Yeah, and Catholics, I should point out, their anti-abortion stance goes all the way back to the beginning. This isn't a new thing that they just decided in 1973. This goes way back to ancient fathers and that sort of thing. Just to point that out.
The Didache has a line or a few lines like denouncing abortion, and that's like one of the oldest recorded sort of like Christian writings that are out there. It's like there's some that I've even connected it to the apostles, that like it was written during a time in which some of the apostles were still alive. So it's like, wow, yeah, it's definitely the case that if you're a Christian and you want to be contiguous with the Christian history, then yeah, you should be against abortion.
Mm-hmm. So he's asking, Sid Tom says, what are your thoughts on the morning pill after sex? So you think you might be pregnant, and so you quickly take that pill.
Yeah, so
Catholics are against contraceptives, by the way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're against contraceptives and they're also against abortifacients. But abortifacients are even more grave of a matter because you're actually exterminating a human life. It's just a human life in a very early process of development, but it's still a human life that had been a fertilized human embryo that has now been eradicated and has been cut off from what it needed in order to remain alive. And so it would be just as if pulling the plug of somebody that was in a hospital bed that was going to recover after 9 months. It's just that like at this current stage in their development, they're not able to sort of express their opinions or desires or even like express themselves in any physically way that we would be able to like visually recognize them to be human. But like the fact that we can't visually recognize a blastocyst as being a human being doesn't mean that like it's not a human being. It's just a human being at a very early process of development. So yeah, like as Catholics, we should be against the morning after pill because it is an abortifacient.
Yeah, great answer. And so
yeah,
it's not, yeah. He's like, wait a second. No, that's a great answer. And it's interesting. I should say I was pro-choice before. I drove a friend to an abortion clinic, so I'm an accessory in my 20s. I said my 20s were pretty rough, but and that's because something like that's included in there. I've got to admit that, and it's a terrible thing. But I changed my mind because I had this nurse when I was getting an ultrasound and I was having an amniocentesis, and my child was probably 15, 16 weeks inside of me, so fully formed little body, tell me that, if it comes back, he's got 2 soft markers for Down syndrome, but don't worry, if it comes back that he has Down syndrome, you can just terminate the pregnancy. And I'm like, what? That's my son. That's Sean. What do you mean terminate the pregnancy? Who are you? But that's how our society is. People want to call these things, they want to depersonalize the baby or say they're not even people. They're not persons. That's the other thing.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's so related to the other areas of Catholic teaching that like it's treating the human person as a commodity when they're like, oh, it's not a person in you yet because like you don't want it. Therefore, like whether you want it or not, that's up to you. You can like, oh, yeah, I got this person growing inside of me, but I don't need it. So like it's not really a person anymore. The same way that like there'll be like it's the Catholic teaching on in vitro fertilization, which is similar in the sense that it's not just treating a human person as a human person, but it's treating them as like a commodity for like, okay, I don't like this genetic makeup, so I'm going to pick this one instead, and then this one can just be terminated. It's like very off, like imagining like you have 15 people that you get to choose from between, okay, I want that one to be my child. And then the rest, they can all be like dropped into a lava pit or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, certainly, that's like a sort of like played up scenario, but it is still this case that you're fertilizing multiple embryos in order to fertilizing multiple eggs in order to get these developing embryos, and just destroying the rest of them. And it's like awful because it is treating the human person as a commodity. It's just at a very early stage of its development.
Yeah, that's actually a good point because I haven't really looked into Catholics' take on in vitro fertilization. But when you think about it, if you make up these connections, you've got the sperm, the egg, the sperm, the egg, the sperm. So you've got all these little potential babies in there. And so that is, what do they do with the babies that don't get picked?
I think they like freeze them apparently. So like they just keep it in storage, but eventually at some point, probably like 15 years down the line or something like that, that's just going to be thrown away in the garbage bin.
That's so sad. I got two people in the chat. I want to say Nikki says she was healed overnight from MS and pancreatic cancer. She was a Jewish atheist at the time. Isn't our God wonderful? And then Keith Colvin said he was healed from all full body arthritis by Jesus. And so got a couple of miracles. I would love to have you guys on my channel to talk about these miracles that are in your life. If anybody else has had a miracle in their life, these are great.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So we've been on for about an hour, a little over an hour. And I'm just wondering, is there anything else you think we should hit on before we kind of close it off?
Yeah. So Sid, I think in the comments was asking.
This is StreamYard.
Yeah.
That was one question.
Okay. Yeah. So there was a comment, John, which view of Mary's virginity do you take, the cousin view or Joseph having children from a previous marriage? I haven't really researched this very much, but as far as I'm aware, there are older sources that have described Joseph as having previously been married. So that's the view that I tend to like just put initially more stock in, just given the fact that it has a little bit older of a connection. But I'm not sure like exactly which one of them is going to be much more plausible than the other, but
yeah, and Jerome was kind of leaning that way too.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, it's just, I guess it's just the idea that Mary herself took these perpetual vows, and also if you can think about the reason why, I think just a reason with this, just really quickly with Brant Petrie and what he had said, and this idea of she being the reversal of Eve. So you had Jesus who came. Adam and Eve were both born without sin, but then they committed sin. And Jesus and Mary were born without sin. The idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, sometimes people don't realize that. She was conceived without sin. So these two are without sin, and they reversed Adam and Eve's sin. So the first Adam, the first Eve, because Paul refers to Jesus as reversing Adam. And you have, then if there's Adam, then who was Eve? And so Mary is actually the queen mother, kind of similar to how Bathsheba was the queen mother of Solomon. And so the queen mother was the intercessor who went between King Solomon and people who wanted to ask a favor of King Solomon. And so the queen mother was very much represented in the Old Testament as being somebody of heightened importance, and kind of brings us into Revelation 12. But
yeah, for sure. Like, seeing that sort of archetypal connection, the type antitype between Christ and Adam. Like Christ is the new Adam, And so, yeah, if there was a new Adam, well, is there a new Eve? And so, like, you can see the sort of connection between uh, someone who was born without sin and then ultimately rejected that in Eve, versus someone who is born without sin and ultimately accepted God's will for them and lived out the life in a way that was fully bearing fruit of Christ and being able to provide salvation for the entire world.
Hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's also kind of interesting, just to mention before we close, that the first miracle that Jesus performed is at the wedding at Cana.
Mhm.
I always think about that and how kind of Mary stepped in, and she stepped in. She was the intercessor between the wedding guests and Jesus, saying, "Hey, they don't have any more wine."
Yeah, it's like,
He's like,
woman,
"Woman,"
it
and he
is not
calls her
my
woman,
time.
kind of like how Eve was called woman. What a
Mhm.
woman! What
Yeah,
what do you expect me to do? She's kind of like, just do whatever he tells you.
yeah,
These other people.
yeah,
So kind of rushing okay, your ministry is beginning today. This is it.
yeah.
So good. So John, what are you working on now that people can, or where can they find you next? Are you going any more video chats or any videos planned upcoming, or just working on your college work?
Yeah, doing my college work. I'm also, so I wrote a 5-page summary of a theodicy that I've been working on, a sort of defense as to why there is so much evil in the world, while God remaining a perfectly benevolent, omnipotent, all-knowing being. And so I wrote that. It's called the Participation Theodicy. It's on my Twitter timeline if anyone wants to read it. And I'm actually going to be chatting with an atheist about it later on next week on Dry Apologist channel. So if anyone wants to, I think Tuesday, yeah, next Monday on Dry Apologist channel, I'll be speaking with Chad about that. And I'm also planning on writing a longer version of that paper, just sort of more thoroughly going through sort of the objections and clarifications regarding it. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully I'll be able to finish that within the next couple months.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Oh, that sounds great. That sounds really good. I just wanted to say, I see this about Jesus's birthday, September 11th, 3 BC. That's Michael Heiser's opinion too, because looking at Revelation 12 and the way that the constellation in the sky was set up on that particular date, the constellation gets like that. It's been like that at certain dates through the centuries, very rarely. And so some people say that September 11th apparently is first Tishri. That's the festival of trumpets, the announcel, the arrival on this September 11th to 3 BC. And a lot of people, there's the church fathers point to either 2 or 3 BC as being when Jesus was born. And so this is highly likely as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, yeah, that would be especially fitting if on the Jewish Feast of Trumpets. That, yeah, what an occasion in which for God Himself to become in the flesh and, well, through being born to the world, being open and received by the world. Yeah.
And that's when Noah was born too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which makes sense too.
Uh-huh.
So, well, great. Well, listen, everybody, please do, if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe and share this with your friends. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God.
Amen.
So I appreciate you coming on my channel, John, so
Yeah, thanks,
much.
Stephanie.
So I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. Thank you, everybody. Here we go.